going to record. So our webinar tonight is a continuation of our Standards Proficient training that you guys are working with. This is kind of part 2 to complete the work that we did during our face-to-face when we met in Aurora. So if you'll remember then, we were looking at the kind of the lesson revision process, and we were using the Martin Luther King assassination speech by Robert F. Kennedy, and we had revised that lesson using a couple of tools. What we're going to do tonight is walk through that same process, but with the science lesson you guys looked at, and we're going to do it a little more, less I do and more you do, right? So we're going to let you guys kind of carry this a little bit and get the habit of doing this work as an expert. So anytime you want to jump in and say anything, totally fine. This is very casual. Just think of us as being around a table together like a critical friends group, and we'll participate in that way. So anytime you want to speak out is fine. Okay. So you have probably a couple of items in front of you, which is great. You should probably have that science lesson material in front of you, and also the pink checklist that you worked from to do your independent work, where you finished that checklist, where you were simply saying, yes, this lesson plan has this criteria, or no, it does not. So we're going to use that as kind of our jumping off point tonight. And we're going to dive straight into the blue lesson revision template form that we were using. And I will have it up on the screen, and I will be typing our responses live. So you don't have to worry about jotting every word down. You can just watch what's going on the screen, participate verbally, and then I will send out that finished lesson revision document to all of you when we're done, so that you'll have a copy of it, if for some reason you would like to have it. Okay, so just a quick reminder as we get started, we are going to function like a critical friends group tonight. So we are going to pretend that the person who wrote this science lesson is with us, so that we'll remember to keep our focus on the lesson itself instead of the person who wrote it. Trying to remember to be encouraging, but also very specific. Doesn't mean we can't criticize, but we want to do it in such a way that the teacher could hear it and receive it and make the improvement. So you've probably got in front of you that packet. If you'll remember, there was the article that you see on the screen, which is the Building Blocks of Life article. There was the quiz, the lesson plan that explained how all that was going to be used, and then also that vocabulary chart that went at the end of the lesson. You should have those components in front of you. So let's talk for a second about your checklist. I looked at all of them in Canvas to make sure that you guys had completed them, and all of you had. You'd done the work. A couple of you had left lots of blanks on your pink sheet, meaning you saw several things that you could not say, yes, I see this present in this lesson. So I'm wondering if you could just, either from memory or if you have your pink checklist in front of you, could you tell me which sections of the pink checklist you thought had the most problems, where you saw the most weaknesses for this lesson? And you can just tell me which number, because they're numbered 1 through 8. If you can tell me which section you thought maybe was the weakest, or where you had a lot of blanks or a lot of no's. So I'll give you a second to think that through, and let me know where you thought the weaknesses were. Sorry, Laura, there was a lot of background noise. You can try it again if you want to. Give it another shot. We've got Raphael said specifically number 5 he felt, which is, oh, and Laura, that was yours too. Okay, great. So we're in a consensus here, for, at least for this first part. Number 5 was the creating questions that draw evidence from the text. You guys felt that that was not a strength, where you had a lot of missing check marks. And I agree completely. I think I had 1 check mark in that category. Another one, 6 was another area, which is the creating writing assignments. I had some missing ones there as well. So we know that at least in a couple of areas, we've got some sections that we really need to look at here, where we think there will be some revision. And it's okay to acknowledge just as we get started, again, even if our group included the writer of this lesson, it's okay to acknowledge that this lesson isn't perfect, and we see several areas where we think we could really improve the standards alignment. And that's the kind of language that we would want to frame that in, not, gosh, this thing is really weak and we can strengthen it, but to say there are a lot of areas here for improvement where we could make this lesson more standards aligned, more rigorous to meet the demand of the standards. There's lots of opportunity for that to happen. And that's a very positive way of saying this has some gaps. So we're going to dive in and take a look. You've already gotten through the sections. We think section 5 in particular has that lack, so we're going to pay special attention to that as we jump into the lesson revision template. Now you probably have a blank one of these. That blue form would have been in the back of your packet probably. If not, you had one in your standards binder that you worked with for the RFK speech, and there will also be one on the screen that you can look for. So what we're going to do is kind of use our checklist as a springboard, and we're going to work on the lesson revision template. So I'm going to pull it up here in a Word doc so that we can work in it, and I'm going to make it nice and big so you guys can see it. And I do want to confess that I've done these webinars many, many times, and so one of the things I've learned is to pre-enter some of the information that I think you're going to say to me so that I don't have to type it all live. Saves a lot of time, and it saves you watching me scramble all over my keyboard and make errors. So don't be alarmed if you see that I've got stuff already kind of pre-prepared in here, because I have a feeling, knowing that you guys are good teachers, you're going to identify some of the same things that I've already seen. So it's all in white font. Yeah, it is a good idea, isn't it, Laura? Yeah, I've already got it ready, and it's all in white, so I can just change the font color. So yeah, it's a good tip. So it'll help us speed through this a little bit, because again, I want to use your time wisely. So remember, as we sit down and look at this lesson revision template, one of the things that we want to do in particular is identify if there's something already on the lesson plan that's really done well. We don't have to change it just for the sake of changing it. We can keep everything that's here. But if we do want to change it, this is where we want to explain the change, okay, is on our lesson revision template. So make sure you've got that lesson plan in front of you. It's kind of turned on its side, and it's double-sided pages stapled together, and it has the lesson title and the NRS level and everything on the top of it. So if you've got that in front of you, let's start with the learning goals. Does the lesson plan have learning goals? If so, are they relevant? Should we keep them? What do you guys think about the learning goals that are on the actual lesson plan as it is?
I think the lesson goals are okay, except for the speaking and listening.
Yes. Okay. So this is a good point, Michael. He said he's okay with the learner goals as written, but one thing he's noted is that there's a big thing missing, which is there are no speaking and listening goals, no standards identified, no goals identified. So this is something that we can absolutely include in here. Perfect. Okay. What else do we notice here other than the fact that we're missing that speaking and listening? Anything else about those learning goals? It's totally okay if you want to type them out in the chat. I know it takes a couple seconds to do that, but it doesn't bother me at all. We can all see them there. He certainly has a learner outcome for the two major functions of this lesson, right? One that deals with the basics of the cells, and one that deals with the multiple meaning science terms, right? He's got one learner outcome, so to speak, for each of those. And then his assessment tools and methods are outlined there as well. So it's very clearly stated. Whether you want to change them or not would be up to you guys, but they are listed on the plan as his learner outcomes, and they do match. So except for this one area that's missing, they're there. Original source, this is the area where if there's anything being used in the lesson that the teacher would need access to, is it spelled out in the lesson plan? So where we find this is on the second page of the lesson plan, right-hand side of the second page where he has his resources listed. And you'll see some websites that he pulls the article and the quiz from. You'll see a couple of places where he got the multiple meaning science words. The PDF came from visualthesaurus.com. So he includes all of the details of where he got his information in the lesson plan. So the original source, we don't have to do anything. It's already provided for us. The only reason you'd need to change something there is if a teacher was asking for you to use something and you don't know what it is or where they got it from. So in this case, we have it. All right, what about intended instructional level? Who is going to be in this classroom according to this lesson plan? Who's being targeted? Do we know that from looking at it? Yeah, thanks, Laura. It is. NRS level 3 is who he's targeting, okay? Now, whether we think that's accurate or not, we can discuss later. But that's who he's after. And remember, NRS 3 is probably 4th through 5th grades. Yeah, but all the way to 5.9. So you're thinking all the way from 4th to 5.9. That's who's being targeted. Great. Okay, so I want to skip to these two bottom questions here. Just quickly, how do you think this lesson would be used in your semester, for instance, if you were teaching? Is this an introductory kind of lesson? Is it a review lesson? A culminating? How do you see this fitting into kind of the structure of a course? What kind of lesson is it?
I think it's definitely not an introduction. It sounds like they're on their way in terms of they've done some things before previous to this.
Mm-hmm.
So in my opinion, it's not a beginning lesson.
Okay. So you think they have to have some kind of probably science background, at least of some kind, that they've been introduced to up to this point. Okay. And certainly
right.
reading text.
Right.
Okay, good. Anybody else with an idea about how this lesson would fit? So I think this is definitely a matter of issue, right? So I do think it's an introductory, mostly because the coverage of the material is pretty brief, right? And it gives a lot of explanation. And as Raphael is saying, yeah, basic, right? A basic coverage of cells. It's not diving deep. Now, I will say that I like Michael's point about you could not give this to students who probably had never seen a science lesson or had never read a science text, right? They would need some foundation there. Yeah. But in terms of the content for cell basics, this is introductory in terms of content, but in terms of type of text, yeah, agreed. They need to have some sort of background. Yeah, very well said. Great. Okay, and does the lesson plan tell us how long this instructor planned to spend on the lesson? Was that identified for us?
Yes.
Yeah,
he says 120-minute class. Yeah,
that's right. Not all lesson plans will do this. He says to do it in 120 minutes. And I will say that is a long time for a science lesson, in my opinion. So it is very possible that you could consider breaking this into 2 chunks, right? Yes, it's here, 120 minutes. You might think to yourself, I could do it in less time, or I might want to break it into 2. Anybody with a specific feeling about which way they might go with that? Would you do it in less time? Or would you maybe not do it at all in terms of both sessions? Would you do it all in one? What do you think?
Well, wouldn't it matter? Wouldn't it depend on the composition of the class in terms of you may have slow learners, you may have fast learners, you may have people who work well with groups. So it depends on, in my opinion, the makeup of the students, the makeup of the class. I may want to go short, I may want to go a little longer.
Yeah.
But at least I'll have that flexibility.
Yeah. Yeah, agreed. And this is where there might be a place to put a couple of notes for the instructor who might pick up this lesson plan and teach it. You might say something like, if everybody in your class really is an NRS 3, for instance, and they're all reading at that level, you can probably do this quicker. But if as you said, Michael, if you've got slower readers, maybe a lower level learner mixed in here, it might take some more time for them. I think those are good notes to say. Yeah. What about this issue in this lesson plan of the two different focuses? The first half being about the cells and the building blocks of life article and quiz, and then the second half of the lesson being related to the multiple meaning science words and that vocabulary activity. Did anybody find a difficulty or an issue with the way that this lesson is structured like that? Anybody at all feel that they would change something there or felt like that could cause an issue? I'll give you a second if you want to type something or if you want to unmute yourself, either way. I don't want to talk over people if they're typing, so I'll just give you a sec, make sure there's nobody typing in the chat. One thing that happens when I look at this lesson plan and I see that two very distinct purposes, this is why it often makes sense to me that to break it into two sessions is that the students seem to be doing two very different things. Reading a text, answering quiz questions versus concentrating on multi-meaning science terms. Two very different things. So I've had several people suggest that they think it would make more sense to separate those two pieces of the lesson, particularly if you have a lot of ELL students in your room for whom that multi-meaning science activity is going to be very difficult. All those words are provided out of context, in isolation. You're basically just given a dictionary and told to write sentences. That could be really challenging. So it is possible that some teachers, depending, as Michael said, on the makeup of their class, might make more sense to break this into two different things and focus on them separately. So just keep that in mind as we move forward. It's just an option of something that might be done. All right, so let's go up to the content standards. There are a couple of standards on the cover of this lesson plan: 2 reading and 1 writing, and as we pointed out at the beginning, no speaking and listening, which we know we should probably add. But let's start with the 3 that are provided. What did you think of these? Are they appropriate? Are they, do we want to keep them? Do we want to change them? Let me see what the first one is. There's a speaking listening we can use. Let's see. There's the writing one.
I liked the first one.
The RVA one? Mm-hmm.
Right, I'm sorry, the RVA one, I thought it was clear and right to the point. So
yep.
That's the way I operate, so I think that was right on. That's just my opinion.
I would agree with you. Here's the definition of that standard from the standards binder. determine meaning of unknown and multiple meaning words based on level appropriate reading content. And it gives you a couple different ways that you can do it. One, you can use the context to figure out the meaning, or you can use a dictionary, which in this case matches the second half of the lesson, which is that vocabulary chart, right? They obviously are reading not words from a text, but words in isolation. So they have to use a dictionary or some sort of reference material. So that fits well. And then the other words that might be in the article that they might have to use their context to figure out fits the A part of that standard. So I agree with you completely, Michael. That 3RVA1 is like, that's a gimme. It stays, right? Because it's such a nice fit. The CI5 one, just if you don't have your standards binder right in front of you, says interpret information presented visually, orally, or quantitatively, like charts, graphs, and diagrams, and explain how the information contributes to the understanding of the text. So this one is interpreting information that's visual. And how does it help you understand the text? My question for you is, do any of the questions that the students get asked require them to use any of the charts or graphs or visuals that are in the article? Because there are a couple. Do any of the questions that they're asked ask them to look at those graphics at all? Laura and Raphael, if you're out there, you can just use the chat box too.
I have been typing in the chat box. Are you not able to see it?
No. You guys, I apologize.
Same here.
I am really sorry. My chat thing didn't expand and it didn't let me see all of that. So I am really sorry. I'm just now seeing all of your comments. Okay, so you guys are definitely in agreement about breaking the lesson into two. Agree completely. Yeah, and as for this issue of using the visual graphs and charts, Lara says they're not really doing much of that. It's not here, right? Are there some visuals in the article? Well, sure. There's 3 little graphics, but none of the questions that they're being asked, whether in the quiz or even in the lesson where the teacher's just saying what he's going to say, none of that is there. So that 3RCI5 has to go, right? It doesn't fit. So we want to replace it with something that is more appropriate. So great. I apologize to you guys for not being able to see my chat. Now I have it expanded to where I can see you. So I promise I won't ignore your comments anymore. Okay, so let's look real quickly before we decide on a different reading standard maybe. Let's look at that 3WRB3. I'll see if I can show you what that one says. Yeah. So this one says to draw evidence from informational text to support analysis or reflection. That's what 3WRB3, which is what the teacher identified on the lesson plan. Do we think that's happening anywhere in this lesson? That they have to draw evidence to support analysis or reflection. What do you think?
I don't think so. I tried looking for that in the lesson plan and I didn't see that anywhere.
Yeah, I agree. Don't you kind of think that the teacher probably really want the students to do this? But there's no question built in here that is actually asking them to do that. Yeah, and Laura says the quiz is just multiple choice questions. There's no reflection, there's no analysis provided. I'll show you where I think this teacher was trying to find this. And it's in the lesson plan under the activities, the instructional activities, which is that left-hand column. On the third page, number 7, activity 7, to conclude his class, he asks for them to write a paragraph response and hand it to him as a ticket out the door. Why are cells called the building blocks of life? My guess is that he wanted that to be the reflection or analysis piece, and wanted them to use evidence from their text to answer it. But so I'll let you guys tell me, what's the problem with that? Do you think the students are going to use evidence from the text to write a really good analysis from that question? Yeah, I agree, Laura. I don't think so. They can answer that question without giving any evidence, without referencing the text, and there is zero way they're going to do that unless you tell them specifically they have to do it. Yeah, completely agree with you, Laura. No student will do that without prompting. You've got to tell them. You have to go back to the text, give me 3 specific examples, et cetera, right? And we know this from experience. Students won't do that unless you make them. So this is one of those areas where I would say that we need to put a little addendum here, which is if we edit the paragraph prompt, right, or the exit ticket, whatever we want to call it, if we edit that, we could make them do this, but we're going to have to make a change. Okay. If we're all in agreement with that, we'll leave it just like that. Okay. Perfect. All right. Let me show you one other standard that I picked out because I knew we wouldn't have time probably to dig through a bunch of these together. I pulled out one that I thought you might think would be appropriate, which is 3RCI1C, which specifically just talks about being able to demonstrate comprehension based on specific information in a science text. I think you could argue, especially if we add in some discussion, that students are being asked to do this, right? Even from just the quiz questions, but certainly we could get them to do it through discussion. So I suggested that one to replace the other reading one. Yeah, I agree. A discussion would make a huge difference to this lesson. Is there anything in particular where you see where a discussion could be added that would make logical sense to you guys? Where would it fit? How would you stick it in, and which standard would we want to go with? So I'll give you just a sec to kind of think through, and I can help us find a standard that might go with. Where would you have them discuss? What would you have them discuss? Partners, whole groups, full class. What do you think? Yeah, Raphael mentions that this might be the time too where we could talk about differentiation a little bit here, maybe using those groups to help if you do have a varied classroom. Yeah, agree completely. Laura suggests that you could use like a KWL activity, and you could be in small groups. You could have somebody kind of facilitate or lead each group and walk the fellow classmates through a KWL. Before the reading, and then look at it again after. That would help too with that differentiation piece, because you could make those groups, you could assign the groups, right? And put people with stronger students with weaker, etc. Yeah, that's a great suggestion. It could be something as simple as that. And if we were to do something like that, we could go with active listening skills. We could go with, I think that's the one I had in here already. Yeah. It could be where they have to listen to their fellow classmates to learn what they're hearing the other person say to add to their knowledge before or after they get through the article. You could also include CC2, which is review key ideas expressed and be able to explain their own ideas. So in that case, they would have to be able to listen to other people's notes on the KWL and add their own. So I think either one of those would work, CC3 or CC2. Yeah, great. Agree that would be nice. And then the speaking part, as Laura points out, could come in if groups had to report out their notes, and the teacher could develop the full KWL for the whole class on the board. I agree. I think that's a really good idea. And that requires a little more of the group because they're held a little more accountable to what they've done if they have to share it out, right? And they have to at least have something that's usable. So those are good strategies, and I think that would work really nicely to hit that speaking listening that Michael told us about at the very beginning was missing. So we've already filled in that piece right here. So we would have to say if we add a KWL chart in groups, shared out to whole class. Perfect. So notice that I'm just sticking these things in here as like, I'm putting them in yellow, meaning to me, yeah, it's there. If we do this one little change, we've got it. We've got what we want. Okay, so that's how we're kind of working through this. Okay, so let's look back through and talk a little bit about text complexity, which is what comes next on our revision template. So I want to show you, because you don't have this article, it's online. You'll notice that it came from an Ask a Biologist is the website. It's on his resource list, the article. I went ahead and ran it through the readable.io, which we talked about at our training just to save us time. I copied and pasted it because it came off a website. It came out as a Flesch-Kincaid grade level of 5.5, as you can see right there on the screen, 5.5. Which if you think back to what he said was his target audience of NRS 3, this is right there, right? It's right in the smack dab middle of his target group. So this is okay to keep, right? A 5.5.
Right.
And we're happy with that. And that turns out to be a match to what he had set as his target. So good job for him. Is it going to push or challenge his students? Probably not, if they really are NRS 3 readers. So that's the other thing, is if the text is not going to push and challenge them because it's not above their level by a little bit, we might have to consider that some of the challenge could come from the discussion, as we just made, or possibly the writing prompt. So just keep that in mind as well. Okay, you remember this idea of the qualitative? What about the text makes it difficult? And I'll show you here on the screen, if you'll remember this rubric for qualitative analysis. I'm going to throw our brains back to that training when we took that RFK speech and we broke it out and said, okay, which component really makes it hard? Is it the structure, the language, the knowledge demands, or the purpose? Or any of this? And you rate it as either slightly complex, moderately, very, or exceedingly. Now, I'm going to make an executive decision and say right now, nothing in this text is exceedingly complex, just period, it isn't. But we could decide that one or the other of this area is maybe a little harder than others. So just as you are thinking through structure, how it's organized, language, knowledge demands, and then purpose, is there one or more of those that you think is more complex than another, that you think might give students some challenge? And I'll leave that up there for just a sec while you think. And in this case, we're talking just about that 2-page text called Building Blocks of Life. What about that do you think might be considered a little more complex? Anything that sticks out? Okay. Laura says she's not seeing much that's challenging here, just kind of across the board in all the categories. So Laura, would you say kind of slightly, like the lowest level for probably all 4 categories? Okay, so Laura says slightly for all. Anybody, any of you other gentlemen think one of these areas could be bumped up to moderate, or are you at the slightly as well? I'll give you a sec to decide.
I think it's okay the way it is. I think it's moderate, a little below moderate. It's okay for that grade level.
Yeah.
That's just my opinion.
Okay.
There's nothing that sticks out that's complicated.
Yeah.
Matter of fact, I think the graphics kind of help out a little bit.
So Michael's pointing out under structure this use of graphics. They're simple. You don't need them to understand the text, but they might offer a little bit of assistance to readers, right? Exactly right. When graphics add to complexity, it's because they're doing something over and above the text. And you have to be able to understand them to be able to dig deeper. Here, these are kind of secondary, right? It's just an interesting thing. If you didn't get this cool thing about the placed end to end around the earth, it doesn't affect your comprehension of the text, right? I think knowledge demands. Do you have to know a bunch of discipline specific content? I would argue no. I think if you had a lot of that, would it help you going in? Yes. But if you don't have it, could you still understand the message of the text? That's the question. And I think the answer is yes. And one of the reasons is because of this specific criteria here, a mix of simple and complicated, more abstract ideas. So I want to point you to one thing. Remember, we always try to use evidence for when we say something. So because I'm with Michael on this one, I think that subject matter knowledge might be able to bump to moderate, and here's why. Like, for instance, on the second page of the article, what are the building blocks of a cell like? He's trying to explain about a plasma membrane, and he's trying to explain what it's like. A plasma membrane is a very abstract idea for students, but he uses the idea of a balloon filled with fluid to give them a visual, a concrete of what that looks like. So in that sense, it's a mix, right, of the abstract with the concrete. That's why I bump it to moderate, because it fits that criteria really well. But I agree with you, Michael, completely. I don't think that means students can't tackle this. It just might be the one thing that throws them just a little as they get going, depending on what type of reader they are. Yeah. Purpose is certainly explicitly stated. It's in the title, right? So we got that one. Language, sentence structure, conventionality, very basic. He even says like, wow, that's a lot of cells, right? Very conversational. And the structure is pretty straightforward, and the titles of each section tell you exactly what's coming. So there's not a lot of difficulty here with the qualitative. And I'll show you, I just pulled out some notes and just to back up, you know, what we say. Having the headings is very helpful. Certainly, you could argue that vocab, that some students, especially if they're ELLs, might find that moderate, but certainly not all. I think probably the meaning and purpose we have to just kind of argue is just slightly, right? And I agree that the knowledge demands is the only area that really bumps up too much to moderate. Okay, so we know the text we're using is accessible. Students are not going to struggle over it too much. So that leads us into vocabulary. Now, several of you noted problems in this area on your pink checklist, okay? And one of which is there's a lot of vocabulary in this lesson in that vocab chart, but all those words are used in isolation. They're not coming out of the text, right? So is there a lot of vocabulary being paid attention to that's actually in the text? Is there support for those students in the text for the vocab? Yeah, Laura says, you know, the lesson plan doesn't really offer it, but there are lots of words in here that could have been pulled out to go over, right? Yeah, and Raphael, he's in agreement too. Yeah, there's not a lot here. Do we think students at an NRS 3 level might find some words in that article that they would struggle with? Yeah, sure. I think they probably would. I pulled out a couple for you just for fun. There they are. Organelles was my first one too, Laura. But all of these words are in there. Could students understand the text without getting all of them? Sure. But are these good science content words? Yeah, I think they are. Here's the problem: is the multiple meaning activity with the chart. Here's what I suggest. This is where the problem is. All of those words that are being used out of context don't help our students really learn those words just by putting them in a sentence. I suggest that you find some words that are in the text that are multiple meaning words and could be put there, like channels, pores, capsules. All of those words can be used in a science context or out of a science context. So, because I've had people before look at this lesson and get very frustrated by that vocabulary chart and want to just throw it out and say, this doesn't have anything to do with cells, let's get rid of it. And most people try to work against that, and they'll argue down to say, well, I like it because I think multiple meaning words is a good activity. It's a good standard to hit. But let's use the words that are in the text. So students who are lower level have the science context. They can go back and look at the word in context and use it. And then they can give a separate example. It gives them a little bit of a boost. So that's one suggestion for how you can build that vocabulary up a little bit and maybe make them come out of the text. Yeah. And as Laura points out here, for an activity like this, if you want to make it really relevant, it's got to relate to the text. If the text is the expert, make the students go back to it, right? And so that's how we can connect those two parts of the lesson to really make them fit well together. So good. So we're going to put that in yellow because we're going to remember that's something that has to be changed, right? Perfect. Okay, that takes us to section 9, which is about the questions. And if you'll remember, these are reading anchor standards, kind of the big, broad standards that we're looking at. And the question is, do any of the questions that are already in this lesson already fill the need, fill the demand of one of the reading standards? So we have two things we can look at. We can look at the quiz, and we can look at that writing prompt for the exit ticket. Why are cells called the building blocks of life? That is a question that the students are being asked. So the question is for you, do any of these anchor standards that you see on your screen get met by any of the questions that are on the quiz or the exit ticket? So I'll give you a second to think about that. Okay. So Laura suggests anchor standard number 2. Which question, Laura, do you think that's in the lesson hits to anchor standard 2? Which one is actually being targeted there? The central idea. Is it from the quiz? Yeah, no, it's not the quiz. It's the exit ticket out the door, right? So certainly we could say, okay, so that writing prompt, that exit ticket, yeah, it does ask them to talk about that central idea or the theme. Does it ask them to analyze its development? No, but we've got about half of it, right? Perfect. Okay, so we've got that addressed. What about the quiz questions? Remember, the person who designed this lesson is with us in the room, so we're going to be gentle, but let's figure out a way that we can say what we think about the quiz questions. In what way would you assess or determine or name those quiz questions? How would you identify them and what's wrong with them?
I think they're kind of straightforward. You don't need
Yes.
much external thinking, or you're not going beyond the limits. It's just, it is what it is. Um, so they don't have to think very much.
Okay, so Michael has chosen a very polite word, which is
Right.
straightforward. I think
Yes.
that's beautiful. Um, Laura says the quiz is asking surface level comprehension, but there's an opportunity here to do more. Yeah,
Right.
agreed. So we've got kind of straightforward questions on the surface only. We have the opportunity to make students dive deeper. I think that's exactly right. You guys have identified, look, there's a problem here. If we talk about depth of knowledge, these are all depth of knowledge 1, right? DOK 1. They're all what we call recall or point and find, right? I can put my finger in the text and go, boop, there it is. There's my answer. Zero critical thinking required, and we want students to go deeper. So I think we'll use both of your wording as we share with our friend across the table. We'll say, hey, I like that you're making students answer quiz questions. I think they should test comprehension, but these are too straightforward. They're too point and click, and we've got an opportunity to get students to dig deeper. Okay, but to do that, guess what we have to do? We have to write some. So this is where, as a team, you would actually have to choose to write a couple of additional questions. Okay. And decide what those are going to be. Where do you want to focus? And maybe you want to keep a couple of the quiz questions and then add some deeper questions as you go. Anybody in particular just have one that they're like, ooh, that would be a good question to ask after they finished reading that article? I would want to ask them blank. Anybody? I'll put you on the spot for just a second, see if anybody has a good question that they would want to ask. All right. I'm checking my scroll button. All right, I don't see anybody typing one yet. So if you are, that's totally fine. Let me show you a couple that I put in here and see what you think. If you like these questions. So here's a couple. According to the text, how is the cell's plasma membrane not like the walls of your house? So that is still a very surface level question, but because it's framed in the negative, it requires them to do a little different thinking, right? Explain the process of cell division. They have to find the section in the text, be able to reread it, and then to explain it in their own words. And then after reading the text, determine the importance of the cell by looking for evidence to support that statement. So kind of the idea of why are cells so important? You've got to be able to tell me after having read that. Yeah. And it's kind of like that question. Yeah, Laura, I like that one too. It's kind of like, so what's the big deal? Like, you know how students sometimes will read something and then they're like, yeah, but so why is that important? Why is this relevant? That's kind of what you're letting them do, is get to the end of the article and say, so why does this matter? And then they have to answer that. Well, cells are really important because blah. It kind of acknowledges their level of frustration with text sometimes that looks unconnected to their lives, and you say, yeah, I know, but these really are important, and now you know why. So giving them a chance to answer that is a good idea. Here's a couple more. Somebody gave me these two that I liked. According to the text, what are 4 jobs that different types of cells can do? You can pull all of that information from there, and also just asking them to identify the parts of a cell that are listed in that text. You'll notice that according to the text, after reading the text, according to the text, right, even the simple list me a couple of items still drives them back to the text, and it just gets them in the habit of doing that. So those are some text-dependent questions that you could add that would either replace the quiz questions or be added to them to make them dig deeper, right? Because if you've got, out of all these anchor standards, only one that kind of half gets at one of the standards, we know our questions aren't good enough. So we want to make them better. So that's what we've done there. And then when we get to the culminating writing assignment, here's that exit ticket. Here's the prompt. What in the world do we need to tell students to do? Because as Laura pointed out at the very beginning, they are not going to use evidence from the text unless you tell them to. So you could put lots of different things to revise the prompt. Anything in particular you guys want to add to make that writing prompt stronger? So Laura suggests using support from the text, explain why cells are important to study. Yeah. Using support from the text, explain. And explain requires them to put it in their own words, right? And to think about it before they start writing. Good. And again, that gets to kind of that relevance issue of why is this important? Why do we want to study this, right? Yeah, very good. I took a kind of a combination approach to mine and just add that kind of that standard according to the text, right? And then I kept the question from the original lesson plan, why are cells called the building blocks of life? And then I gave them one little additional note to note the functions of a cell that make it important to life. So that for students who don't know where to start, right? When you say, according to the text, why are cells called the building blocks of life? Or using support from the text, explain why they're important. They might be like, where do I start? So instead, I gave them that one keyword, which is, what are the functions of a cell? So for those students who are not your strong thinkers, not your strong writers, and they need a point in the right direction, that one would do it for them. If you have higher level students who don't need the help, you can go with Laura's and just leave them loose, and they'll figure it out. So that's a matter of choice based on who your students are. All right, the last thing we've got to do is look at this extension text or research project connected to this text. There's one extension suggestion listed under the resources, which is on the second page of the lesson plan. I want you guys to take a peek at his extension resource that's listed in the lesson plan and tell me what you think about it. It's at the very bottom of the second page of the lesson plan. What is he having them do? And do you know anything at all about that resource? Oh, Laura, yes it is. Laura says, wait, isn't the Common Core Achieve the more advanced book? Yes, it is. And when you say more advanced, it is not only 9th through 12th grades, but most teachers who have used the science book in particular say they wouldn't even give it to anybody below NRS 6, just 11, 12. It's that high, it's that complicated, it's that heavy. So yes, completely right. Think about it. Remember who our target audience is? This teacher said, I want to target my NRS 3 students. And yet his extension that they're going to do independently is written at a 9th grade or higher. So we've got a disconnect here big time. So Laura said, hey, you know what? Basics, the Common Core Achieve or Common Core Basics might be the more appropriate level. So you could consider using the Basics book for a cell lesson, right? Here he had already identified one. It's lesson 3.1, but I'll bet you the Basic book has one too. You could find it and use that instead. Okay, excellent. So these are the little things about a lesson plan that you don't want to accidentally turn that over to a student, be like, hey, there you go, and then realize too late that the material is way over their head. That's just an invitation for frustration. So that's a good catch on that. The other thing I would suggest is, if you remember, this is from a website called Ask a Biologist. Not only did the article come from it, but so did the quiz. He just took the quiz right off the internet, which is fine, but that's another reason why we probably needed to rewrite some of those questions, because the teacher probably didn't analyze it very carefully because it was a prepackaged thing, right, that came with the website. It's just another good reminder to us that that web resources are great, but we need to screen them pretty carefully before we use them. So the other thing that you could do is go out on that website, Ask a Biologist, and look around at some of the other stuff that the website has. Like, it has videos and it has graphics and it has other things that you can print off and use. So that's another suggestion if you wanted to give people an extension. All right, so remember we had talked about, as our big changes, consider splitting this into 2 lessons, or changing those words on that vocab activities and make them to be words out of the text. We wanted to do both of those things, right? So we want to do that. And the other thing we wanted to do was add the KWL chart activity for speaking and listening. So once we've done that, we're going to be in great shape. Anything else that you want to say about this lesson overall that you think needs to be done as far as our revision work goes to make it really well standards aligned, other than what we've got so far? I'll give you a time for a last word. Any other changes that you would make?
Can I make a comment?
Of course.
Yes, I would say, would you say that generating good quality questions for a lesson plan are probably the hardest things to do?
Well,
or is it just for me?
Oh, no. I was going to say amen after you spoke, because I agree completely. I hear that from people. Remember when we went through our Standards Foundations course in Canvas and we looked at text-dependent questions there? The most common feedback I get in people's journal entries is that writing good questions is the hardest thing they do. And what the default is you tend to default to the questions that are in the book because they're already there, right? And that's so we just use them. Yeah, I agree with you completely. I think it's the hardest thing to do well, and it's also time consuming. When the book is already there, it's already got the 10 questions, just use them. But if we look at the questions a lot of times, especially from an online site or a textbook, yeah, we find things that we're like, this is not a good question. It doesn't dive deep. I could do better. And as Raphael points out, if you have mixed NRS levels in your classes, a lot of times the questions that are in the book might be appropriate for part of your class, but they're not good for all of the class. So that's another issue you have to think about. Yeah, completely correct. Absolutely right. I think that one thing to think about is the issue of the text dependency is even just the simple addition of where do you see this in the text, or according to the text, or with support from the text explain to me blank. Simply requiring that makes most questions better than they are on the surface. That one simple addition. The other thing that I heard somebody say the other day that I thought was just a great suggestion. I was at COABE at the national conference, and I was at a reading session. And this lady said that she numbers all of her paragraphs of every text she ever uses, even if it's just in pencil. And then every time she has a set of questions, a question set, she will make them reference the paragraph number where they found the answer, so that they get in the habit of showing evidence from the text. Even if it's multiple choice, she makes them write the number of the paragraph where they found their answer. And I thought that was a really good strategy for, again, it's simple. It doesn't mean you have to rewrite all the questions, but what you're doing is you're saying, I'm making my students think, where did I get this answer? Did it come off the top of my head? No, I went into the text. Where did I go? There. And that gets them in the habit of citing evidence. So that's another thing that you can think of as an option You don't have to rewrite the question, but make your students say, and after you've written the answer, tell me what paragraph number it came out of. So, yeah, Laura has also mentioned that just kind of as an overall comment, she would love to see an image of a cell that's nice and big and detailed and colorful. I agree completely. I think as part of that article reading, that should be up on the screen or a handout of some kind where they can actually see a nice broken out detailed picture of the cell. Yeah, completely agree. Wonderful. Okay, what I'll do, and not that you have to do anything with it, but if for some reason you're like, this lesson's pretty cool, I would use it, but I would want to make the changes that we made, I'll send this to you guys so that you have it, and you can print it off and use it if you want it. It's just there for you as an in case, okay? So what you would do, remember, if we are in a critical friends group and we just finished doing this together, the thing that we would be doing now is we would be giving all of our notes that we just wrote from our lesson revision template. We'd be handing them to the person who brought the lesson. And he would then take it home, make the revisions, and then he would send it back out by email to everybody in the group so that they can all have this completed, nicely revised lesson. So that would be, in theory, what we would do if we were finishing up here. So one of the things I want to do as we kind of shift gears just a little bit tonight, I want to tell you about how this process could fit into a larger professional development initiative in your local programs, okay? Like if you were really trying to conduct some lesson revisions and really work as a team to do this kind of effort together, what would it look like? So give me a few minutes to explain this, and then I want to hear from you afterwards about what you think of this process called a lesson study. And if you come out of a K-12 background, this may be familiar to you already, so bear with me here. So first things first, we're talking about cooperative work groups. In adult ed, we do not have a good history of doing this. So one of the things we're trying to do as we professionalize the field and as we encourage each other to work more carefully together is in collaborative groups, this is the kind of thing you would do. It certainly reinforces the key shifts that we talked about: text complexity, evidence, building knowledge, and helping teachers reach the demands of the specific standards per level. People need to have help doing that, so we would be doing that together. You get to work with your colleagues to share and work with lessons, and it also includes an observation piece that allows teachers to observe each other in a non-evaluative function. And that is, again, something that does not happen often in adult ed, and we really should have the opportunity to do so. So here's how the process of a lesson study works. In your critical friends group, somebody brings a kind of a bare-boned sample lesson that they have created or that they've gotten from a book that they tend to use and like. And then what you would do is you would share that with the critical friends group. And then you would figure out a way for everyone to observe that lesson in action, not just on paper like we're doing tonight with the science lesson, but actually watch it being taught in the classroom. That could be a physical observation of you in the room, or it could be a recording of the class where you watch it on video later. And I'll talk to you about that here in just a second. You would use that critical friends feedback checklist to make sure everybody's using the same kind of language as we talked about before. And then one member of the group, it doesn't have to be the person who brought the lesson, but one member would take that lesson and teach it in their classroom and have everybody else observe it. Again, either physically in the room or on video later. If you're physically in the room, just a couple quick reminders, you're going to assume the role of a researcher. You're not there to evaluate. You're not there to interact. You're there to simply sit quietly, observe, and make sure that the natural atmosphere of the classroom is being supported. And certainly you would want to be making observations about what you're seeing in the classroom. Then after that observation has happened, the group gets back together and they discuss what they saw. Were the lesson goals clear? Were they targeting standards? Did the activities that were being done in the classroom actually support the original goals and standards that were identified? Did it flow well? And then what did the students' responses show about what they were learning? That's the piece you cannot get from a lesson plan on paper, right? Some of this actually, several of these, but that one in particular only happens when you're in the room and watching. So you guys get together and you discuss these questions, and then you actually let the teacher who taught go first. Let them talk and say, you know, this went wrong, or I saw this was happening, and, you know, give them a chance to get it kind of off their chest, and then let everybody who observed be very specific and provide lots of evidence for their observations. Okay. And then as a group, you do what we just did on that blue revision template tonight. You revise it. You say, okay, based on what we see on paper and what we saw when we watched it happen in the classroom, these revisions need to happen. It could be adjusting the text difficulty. It could be providing academic vocabulary support. It could be rewriting some of the questions, as Michael was just talking about. Could be changing the activity at the end to make it more aligned to a standard. Whatever it is, you revise it. And then in a full lesson study process, you would pick another group member then to take that revised lesson and go teach it again in their classroom. And ideally, you would let everybody observe that second time and see how it goes and reassemble to talk about how it went. Do you see improvements? Did it make it better, etc.? And then you would make those final little changes, have a finished lesson to add to your library. That is the whole process. Provide a lesson, everybody watch it in action, debrief and revise it, have a second teacher teach it and observe it and decide if it was an improvement or not. That's the lesson study process. Now, what I want to talk to you about is the following. What are the benefits to doing that? Sounds great. I think you would learn this, or I think you would get this from it. What about challenges? And if we find challenges, what could be some solutions to those challenges? So let's talk about that for a minute. Do you see, I'll let you do either one, a benefit and or a challenge to trying to do something like that lesson study process in your local program? What do you see? Benefit, challenge. I'll give you one or the other. You can pick.
I see a benefit.
All right. What's that?
Well, what it generates consistency throughout the program because everybody's on the same page.
Michael,
that's just one thing. Yeah.
If I get to say amen again, that's your second one, because that is exactly one of the reasons why I like this process. Is it puts everybody in the room, everybody sees the same thing, hears the same conversation, is aiming for the same kind of standards alignment, right? And then they're all aiming to the same place. I agree with you completely. It standardizes things. Perfect. Okay, I love that. Laura says, anytime you get to observe other teachers, you benefit from that. I agree with that completely. I don't even think it has to be a teacher in a similar classroom as yours. It can be just a completely different classroom. You still benefit from watching others. Raphael notes that everyone gets to give input. When you do a process like that, nobody just sits in the corner quietly and everybody gets to say what they saw, what they think could be improved, etc. So there's input, buy-in from everyone. Challenge, yes. Lara says teachers aren't going to be able to get in and out of each other's classes very easily. Physically observing your peers is very difficult. Many of you come from programs that have multiple locations. You have morning teachers, night teachers. Sometimes those people never see each other, right? This is a legitimate concern. So you would almost have to use some sort of video option. And I will tell you, just so that I can just reassure you that it can be done, I will tell you that in the pilot of this standards proficient training back in 2016, Elgin Community College up north and Lincoln Land Community College down south, those were the two pilot schools. We did this lesson study. We recorded it when the northern teacher brought the lesson and taught it. And then we all got together on a Zoom digital video conference like we're doing tonight. We all got together. We talked about what we saw. We revised it together online through a lesson revision template. And then one of the southern teachers took it, the revised lesson, and she taught it in her class and recorded herself. And we all watched it and then we all came back and talked about it again. We did this living in completely different cities. So it can be done. It does take effort. I am not going to say that it doesn't. In both instances, the college, the institution where the teacher taught, provided a video camera, and then we uploaded it to our YouTube channel and just shared a link that way. There's multiple ways it can be done. If it's a short enough lesson, you could even do it on a phone. You can record short bits on a phone, and you can send those links to each other as MP3s. There's lots of different ways that it can be done. So anyway, I can talk about that with you later, but there are ways you can get around it. But certainly, I agree with you. It's beneficial to observe. It's hard to make it work logistically. Video recording is probably a good option. The other thing I would just say is, for the possible challenges, is it's time consuming to do something like this. And so you almost have to work with your administrator to be creative about getting professional development time as a critical friends group. We talked about that at our face-to-face. Don't forget that moving forward, once you're not doing this big training, you are going to need PD hours in the next upcoming fiscal year. This is the kind of thing you can send as a proposal to your administrator to say, we're going to use this lesson study model that we got from the state. We're going to walk through it. And we're going to come out with 2 completed, lessons or whatever. And that way people can get some professional development hours for their time. That's just a suggestion that I'll give. And certainly that would look different for everybody. So one thing I do want to tell you too about the lesson study is that when we did this with our 2 pilot programs, Elgin and Lincoln Land, kind of like Raphael was talking about having a multi-level class, one of the teachers, the one who taught it first, she had an NRS 5-6 class, and it was a social studies lesson. And so it was very targeted to that NRS 5-6, the ASE group, right? 9 through 12. Then when we got ready to teach it the second time, the teacher who volunteered to teach it down south, she had a multi-level class. So what we had to do to that lesson? We had to revise it to make it applicable in a multi-level classroom. So when we finished our lesson study, we actually came out of it with 2 different lessons, one for NRS 5-6 group and one for a multi-level class. And we had 2 versions of the same lesson. So teachers who had that kind of class could pick the one that was most useful to them. That's another great thing that can happen out of a critical friends group, is somebody can have this great lesson and you can be like, well, yeah, but I can't use that because I have ELLs, or I have multi-level, or I do blah. You sit down, you work through it with a group, and you can figure out how to make that applicable to a multiple of your colleagues. So it's just another reason why working together can be really cool. Yeah, and Raphael's going, hey, how'd you do that? Yes, we changed the questions. We changed one of the texts. We literally pulled one of the texts that was being used, and we found a substitute text that was on the same content area, same topic, but it was written at a lower level. We did rewrite a couple of the questions, and then we added a vocabulary support at the beginning of the lesson that we thought that multi-level group and that had a lot of ELLs in it, they needed that more than that NRS 5-6 group did. So we made those 3 big changes. But it was kind of fun to come out of it with 2 different ones. Yeah. And I will say that some programs might not find that necessary, but if you do have a program that has different kinds of classrooms, and Laura, I agree with you, it literally starting your group project with, we're going to come out of this probably with more than 1 lesson plan. And that being a good thing, right? I think that's great. I think that's exciting. Nobody has to make theirs look like everybody else's, right? You want to make your lesson plan look like it should work for your class. So that's a great suggestion and a way to go with it. So, and anything like that you've got rolling around in your head, I'm more than happy to offer other suggestions or tell you more about something. I'd be glad to. So let me tell you about, we're almost done here. I just need to give you kind of your final assignment for this part 1 that we are completing tonight, which is you're going to do a very modified version of a lesson study. Okay, don't panic on me because you're thinking, oh my gosh, that stuff she just talked about, we have to do it modified. Okay, you have 2 choices. You can either figure out a way to get into one of your peer teachers' classrooms and observe part of a lesson and then complete the lesson study feedback form, which is the 5 questions we just saw on that previous slide. Or if you can't get into a fellow teacher's classroom to observe, that's fine. In Canvas is a pre-recorded video of an adult education classroom where a lesson's being taught, and you can watch that at your convenience and complete that same lesson study feedback form. That's what we're going to ask you to do as our modified lesson study. You'll be working on it independently instead of as a group, but pretend you're doing the observation piece and completing that feedback form. In Canvas, under the Interim Activity, is what it's called, you'll see both of these options listed out inside Canvas. You can either, again, go to a co-teacher, ask to observe them, go in and observe, and then fill out the feedback form, or you can go and watch the video. And it's in Canvas. There's that link right there, but you don't have to write that down. It's inside Canvas where you just click on it, and it will literally take you right to the YouTube, and you can watch it from there. The lesson study feedback form that has those 5 questions on it that I showed you a minute ago, it's also in Canvas as a Word doc. You can open it, type your responses in there, and hit submit right within Canvas to me, okay? And that is the assignment that we're going to do by May the 2nd. And you might think, well, why May the 2nd? What's that with the due date? Because we're going to see each other on May the 3rd, and I need to have it before I see you. So everything's in Canvas. All the instructions, remember to look under Interim Activity. That's the page where it's listed. The video to watch is there. The feedback form is there. Everything. I will say, if you're going to watch the video, 2 things I want to tell you. Number 1, it is that NRS 5-6 class that I told you about when we taught it in our pilot. That's the video. So that's a higher level student group. So the lesson is written at a higher level. And number 2, I want to tell you, it's long. I think it's an hour and 18 minutes or something like that. So please fast forward when you feel the need, okay? If students are reading quietly, if the teacher's reading out loud, if she's moving around the room and answering questions, feel free to grab that little red dot and just move it forward a little bit, okay? Don't be a slave to that time. If you are in a hurry and you're running out of time, fast forward it a little bit. It won't hurt. I want you to get an idea of how the lesson is working. So don't worry about watching every single second of it, okay? So that is the interim activity, and you're going to do that. And once you've turned that in by the end of the day, May 2nd, then we see each other again for our last face-to-face, which is May the 3rd. Remember, last time we got done at 12:30. We're going to end at noon this time. So it's 9 to noon, same room, same parking situation, everything for May the 3rd. And we'll be there again at Aurora in our same spot. So any questions that you've got, you can let me know. I'm, of course, always happy to help you. Send me an email or send me a note in Canvas or whatever. But that's what you've got going for your interim activity. And then when we'll see each other again on May the 3rd, we'll be working on a new innovation for standards alignment, which is dealing with assignments and student work. So we'll be dealing a little bit, Michael, with some of those how to write good questions. We'll be looking at that again. So, all right. Excuse me. So if anybody has any questions, feel free to ask. Excuse me. Otherwise, we're done for the night. You can simply hit the X at the top of your little GoToMeeting bar, and it'll shut the program down, and you'll be ready to go. And let me know if you've got questions once you look at the activity in Canvas. Thanks for your evening tonight, guys. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Good to talk to you.